Samuel Price sits in silence, hands cuffed, head bowed, while the courtroom air seems to hold its breath. The judge's gavel hovers just above the block as murmurs echo, "Thief, liar, ungrateful old man." And then, with a single door's crash, two figures appear. Noah, once a frightened boy, now a man in a crisp suit, and Lila standing behind him, steady and fearless, and Samuel's life hangs in the balance. Decades ago, he took in two starving children off the streets, risking everything he had to give them a chance. Tonight, those same children will decide whether he walks free or spends his days behind bars. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The winter that year was merciless, one of those seasons where the cold pressed against skin like knives, where the smoke from chimneys clung low over worn streets, and steel mills gave the town a permanent gray haze. Samuel Price walked with a limp that had never healed from decades on the factory floor, his breath heavy, his coat too thin for the kind of night that seemed to freeze even the strongest bones. Most men hurried past him, eyes down, rushing home to warmth. But Samuel carried himself slowly, each step a reminder of years of labor and each ache a secret he had long ago accepted. And then, as he cut across a narrow back alley, he saw them. Two children huddled against the rusted side of a dumpster, their clothes nothing more than rags, their lips pale and cracked, their bodies shaking as though their small hearts could not bear one more hour of winter. Samuel stopped, his breath fogging in the dark, and for a moment he considered doing what others had already done. Look away, walk on, preserve the little he had. But the boy lifted his head, eyes hollow but watchful, his arm wrapped around his sister with a kind of desperate protection no child should be forced to know. The girl, smaller, leaned against him, her cheeks streaked from cold tears that had already frozen. Samuel knelt slowly, his knees stiff, his hands rough and calloused as he whispered, "Do you have anywhere to go?" Neither child spoke. Noah, the boy, only shook his head once, tight and fearful, while the girl, Lila, looked up at him as though unsure if he was real. Samuel exhaled, and in that moment he knew he could not leave them. He had been discarded once by the world too, made to feel invisible, and he would not let these two remain unseen. With a steady hand he reached out. Lila's tiny fingers slipped into his palm, ice cold, but her touch held a plea for safety she could not voice. Noah hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the empty street as if waiting for another insult to fall, but when his sister tightened her grip, he stood and followed. The three of them walked through the bitter air, Samuel leading with quiet determination, while whispers stirred from the windows they passed. "That fool," a neighbor muttered, watching through a cracked curtain. "Old man can't even feed himself, now he's dragging strays inside." Another voice joined, laced with scorn. "He'll sink with them, mark my words." Samuel heard them, as he always did, but he did not slow his steps. Behind him trailed two fragile lives, clinging to the first hint of hope they had seen in days, maybe years. Inside Samuel's modest apartment, the walls were yellowed with age. The wallpaper peeling and a single rattling heater fought desperately against the cold. He found what blankets he could, spreading them across his sagging couch, then set a pot of broth to warm, the steam filling the room with a faint comfort. Noah and Lila ate as though they had not seen food in days, hunched over their bowls, their eyes darting as if someone might snatch it away. Samuel watched quietly, resting his aching leg, a tired smile breaking through the heaviness of his face. He knew tomorrow would bring more humiliation at the factory, knew Mr. Dalton would mock him again, knew the neighbors would whisper louder, but in that moment it no longer mattered. He had made a choice. Those children would not sleep on frozen concrete again, not as long as he drew breath. And with that silent vow, Samuel Price began a chapter of sacrifice that would shape the rest of his life. Samuel Price returned to the factory floor each morning with shoulders stooped, his limp more pronounced with every year. The clang of steel, the hiss of molten metal, and the harsh shouts of foremen had become the soundtrack of his life. For Mr. Dalton, Samuel was his favorite target. Dalton stood tall with a permanent sneer etched across his face, always searching for the moment to cut deepest. He waited until the machinery quieted and the other men could hear, then barked across the floor. "Even those strays you dragged home probably move faster than you, Price." Laughter followed, some nervous, some eager to please. Samuel never raised his head, never snapped back. He wiped his brow, adjusted his grip on the heavy tools, and kept moving. But each insult, each public humiliation was a stone added to the weight he carried home every night with his aching leg and tired back. The gossip did not end at the factory gates. In the narrow stairwells of Samuel's apartment building and in the corner shops where bread was rationed thin, whispers followed him. "A black man raising 2 white kids?" one woman muttered, shaking her head with pity she did not mean. "They'll betray him the first chance they get," another man added, his voice carrying down the hall. "Mark my words, they'll forget him when they grow." Samuel heard, though he never answered. Instead, he chose silence, the same silence he had mastered through years of insults and prejudice. But at night, when the door creaked open and Noah and Lila ran to greet him, the echoes of cruelty softened. Noah, clutching a battered schoolbook, read aloud what he had learned that day, his young voice full of eagerness. Lila scribbled with her dull pencil, sketching houses that looked warmer than the one they lived in. One evening, as Samuel collapsed into his chair, his limbs heavy from Dalton's taunts and the factory's strain, Lila climbed onto his lap, her small arms circling his neck. She whispered a word so soft he nearly missed it. "Dad." Samuel froze, his chest tightening, and before he could respond, Noah looked up from his book and added firmly, "Yeah, you're our dad." Samuel's throat closed with emotion. He had never expected such a title, never thought it belonged to him. But in that moment, the years of loneliness cracked open. He managed only a quiet nod, his hand trembling as it rested on theirs, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself a flicker of joy. That single word bound them together more tightly than the bloodlines others insisted were missing. To the world, they were broken pieces stitched together. To Samuel, they were his family, and nothing else mattered. But family built on sacrifice and love is not always safe from envy. While Samuel cherished the warmth of Noah and Lila's words, while he patched their jackets with clumsy stitches and gave them his portion of bread, Mr. Dalton was watching. Dalton's pride twisted each time he saw Samuel walk home with his head just a little higher, saw those children cling to him as though he was worth something. Dalton despised it. To him, Samuel had stolen dignity he did not deserve, stolen loyalty that should have belonged to men like Dalton. And though Samuel carried no thought of vengeance, Dalton nursed it daily, feeding on it until it hardened into resolve. He would not rest until Samuel Price was broken, stripped of the small triumphs he had carved from a world that tried to erase him. Because Mr. Dalton was not finished, not by far. He was planning, waiting, and the day would come when he would strike at the very heart of everything Samuel had built. Despite the taunts of Mr. Dalton and the cruel whispers of neighbors, Samuel Price found small victories blooming within the walls of his home. Noah, once the frail boy shivering in an alley, now excelled at school with a sharp mind and determination that startled even his teachers. He brought home papers filled with perfect scores, essays praised for their clarity, and books that he devoured late into the night. Lila, timid and quiet in her early years, began to raise her voice with courage. Her first speech contest at school brought her to the stage, trembling at first, then steady as she declared her thoughts with conviction. The judges applauded, and for the first time, Samuel watched his little girl stand tall, her voice carrying across a room with strength no one could deny. These moments were not grand to the world, but to Samuel, they were proof his sacrifices had meaning. Yet behind every triumph, Samuel hid burdens that would have crushed another man. His wages, already thin, were cut without explanation, and though the slip of paper burned in his pocket, he never spoke of it to Noah or Lila. Instead, he worked double shifts, his limp dragging heavier across the concrete floors of the factory. He endured Dalton's laughter when he asked to stay longer. "Look at him," Dalton sneered to the men, "breaking his back for scraps. For what? To feed mouths that don't even belong to him." Samuel said nothing. At night, when Noah studied by candlelight and Lila scribbled in her notebook, Samuel smiled, hiding his aching hands and weary frame. He chose to let them see pride, not suffering, and he carried that weight alone, believing the children deserved joy unburdened by his quiet struggles. But the cost of love is often heavier than the world expects. When Lila fell ill one winter morning, her body weak with fever, Samuel knew he faced a choice. The factory would not excuse him, and Mr. Dalton would not forgive lost hours. Yet Samuel could not leave her side. He held her hand as she shivered beneath thin blankets, then led her to the clinic, each step stealing coins from his already bare pockets. The doctor treated her, and Lila's small smile afterward was enough for Samuel to endure what came next. Dalton, red with fury, spat when Samuel returned. "You think you can just walk out on my floor? You're not their father, Price. Stop playing hero." Then, lowering his voice so only Samuel heard, Dalton hissed, "One day, I'll bury you for this." The words clung like ice, but Samuel kept his head low, answering only with silence. Dalton's anger was not empty. Days later, as Samuel returned from work, he found 2 officers waiting by his apartment door. Their uniforms crisp, their eyes cold, they pushed past him without a word. Neighbors gathered in doorways, whispering predictions of disgrace. Samuel stood frozen as drawers were pulled open, cushions overturned, until at last one of the officers lifted a bag from beneath his couch. Inside, bills of cash and equipment stamped with the factory's mark. Samuel's chest tightened, his throat dry. He had never seen it before. Still, the metal bit his wrists as handcuffs locked around him. In the hallway, Mr. Dalton's smirk lingered like a shadow, his voice carrying across the stairwell for all to hear. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all." And with that, Samuel Price was dragged into the night, accused of crimes he had never committed, his sacrifices erased in an instant, his fate sealed in chains. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and dust, its benches filled with faces that had known Samuel Price for years, but had never truly seen him. The prosecutor rose with confidence, his words sharp as he painted Samuel not as a man of sacrifice, but as a bitter laborer, too prideful to admit his failures, too desperate to survive without stealing from the very factory that had employed him. "Here is a man," the prosecutor declared, "who could not provide for himself, who dragged in strays to mask his own inadequacy, and when the weight grew too heavy, he turned to theft." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. To many, it fit the story they had already whispered behind closed doors. Samuel sat hunched at the defendant's table, hands clenched in his lap, his back bent under accusations that carried more weight than any steel beam he had lifted in his years at the factory. Witnesses came forward, each one with the same rehearsed conviction. Men who had worked beside Samuel for decades now raised their hands and swore they had seen him near storage rooms, near locked doors, slipping away with company property. Their eyes flickered as they spoke, but the jury caught only the words, not the hesitation. Mr. Dalton had paid them well, and their loyalty now belonged to the weight of his coin. Samuel wanted to stand, to shout that they were lying, that the man who had skipped meals so children could eat would never take what did not belong to him, but his voice caught. For too many years he had been taught silence in the face of insult. Too many years he had learned that arguing only fed laughter and scorn. So he lowered his gaze and let the accusations rain down without reply. In the back rows, neighbors leaned close, smirking as though the trial confirmed every word they had spoken in shadows. "We always knew he'd end up here," one woman whispered to another. "A man like that doesn't just take in children for nothing." Heads nodded, lips pursed in satisfaction, as though Samuel's downfall was proof of the order they had long believed in, that kindness was weakness, that sacrifice was foolish, that a man like Samuel could never truly rise above his station. Their judgment burned worse than the prosecutor's words. Samuel's eyes flickered once toward the crowd, catching sight of familiar faces, but instead of comfort he saw only vindication in their eyes. He lowered his gaze again, ashamed, not of what he had done, but of the weight he carried that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. And in that silence a thought crept in, heavier than the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Maybe kindness really was a mistake. Maybe Dalton was right. Maybe all the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the meals skipped, the warmth given away, were nothing more than wasted effort, destined to end in humiliation. Samuel's shoulders slumped further, his head bowed as the gavel echoed to call order. He had given his life to raising Noah and Lila, to building them a future brighter than his own, but sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by lies, he believed for a fleeting moment that it had all been for nothing. The man who once lifted children out of the cold now sat alone, awaiting the judgment of a world that had never shown him mercy. The courtroom had sunk into a rhythm of condemnation. Each witness repeated lies, the prosecutor's voice dripped with certainty, and Samuel Price sat in silence, his head bowed as though he had already been condemned. The gavel tapped once to summon the next testimony when suddenly the heavy doors at the back of the chamber swung open with force. All eyes turned. Two figures stepped through the threshold, their presence cutting through the stale air like a blade. Noah stood tall in a dark suit, his face calm yet unyielding. The nervous boy Samuel once guided, now replaced by a man shaped for this moment. Beside him, Lila clutched a recorder, her eyes bright, her jaw firm, the timid child who once drew houses on scraps of paper, now a journalist ready to expose the truth. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery as the siblings walked forward, their gaze locked on the man who had raised them. The prosecutor sneered, trying to regain control, but Noah's voice carried with a steadiness that silenced the room. Introducing himself as Samuel's counsel, he began to question the witnesses with precision, sharpened by years of study. The men who had spoken so confidently faltered under his calm interrogation. Dates did not match, details shifted, and their rehearsed statements began to unravel. One witness stammered when Noah asked him to repeat where exactly he had seen Samuel. Another contradicted himself within minutes. The jury leaned closer, sensing cracks spreading through what had seemed like a solid case. The prosecutor's objections grew louder, but Noah met each one with composure, dismantling their arguments piece by piece, until the weight of their lies collapsed under the truth. Samuel, sitting at the defense table, watched in stunned silence, his heart swelling as the boy he once protected now stood as his shield. Lila rose next, requesting permission to present evidence she had gathered. Her hands did not tremble as she lifted documents and reports, her voice unwavering as she spoke of Mr. Dalton's long history of corruption, wage theft, falsified accounts, harassment of workers, each accusation backed by records she had uncovered as a journalist. The gallery erupted in murmurs, shock spreading as Dalton's name was spoken not as a master of industry but as a thief of men's labor. Dalton's face flushed crimson, his fists clenched at his sides as he glared at the young woman who refused to flinch under his hatred. For years he had tried to crush Samuel, and now Samuel's daughter stood before him exposing the truth he had buried. The balance of power in the courtroom shifted, and for the first time, Dalton's smirk faltered. His empire of lies cracked under the weight of the evidence, and the world began to see him for what he truly was. One witness, confronted directly by Noah with Lila's documents in hand, broke under the pressure. His voice shook as he admitted he had never actually seen Samuel steal anything, that he had only repeated what others suggested. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had whispered condemnation now silenced as the foundation of the accusations collapsed. Samuel closed his eyes, unable to stop the tears that welled, not from defeat, but from the realization that the children he once carried from the cold now carried him. Years of sacrifice had come full circle, their strength born from the love he had given in silence. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the bench, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. His voice, when it came, carried authority that silenced the restless room. "This case," he said firmly, "is built on lies." The gavel struck, and the sound echoed like thunder, shattering the cage that had been closing around Samuel Price. The gavel struck, and the echo carried through the courtroom like a release of chains. The charges against Samuel Price were dismissed, the carefully woven lies unraveling in an instant. A hush fell over the gallery, the same neighbors who once whispered insults now sitting in silence, their eyes lowered. Mr. Dalton rose in rage, his face twisted red, his fists clenched with humiliation. He tried to speak, but no words came. The judge's gaze cut through him with finality, and as Dalton stormed out, the weight of disgrace clung to him heavier than any sentence Samuel might have borne. Years of cruelty, manipulation, and hatred collapsed in front of those who once admired him. For the first time, Samuel saw Dalton not as a tyrant towering over him, but as a man undone by his own malice. The factory boss who had mocked him was now the one diminished, and the courtroom knew it. Noah closed the thick folder of documents, his expression calm but triumphant. He stepped to Samuel's side, placing a hand firmly on the old man's shoulder. Lila crossed the room, her recorder blinking red as she moved close, her eyes soft but filled with strength. She leaned in, whispering words Samuel had never dared hope to hear. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." Samuel's eyes blurred with tears, the sound of that single word, Dad, resonating louder than the gavel itself. It was not a title given out of pity or obligation, but a truth carved out of years of sacrifice, stitched together through hunger, cold, and perseverance. For decades, Samuel had carried burdens silently, his back bent, his heart weary. But in that moment, something shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his back, his shoulders rising as he stood taller than he had in years. He met the eyes of the world not with shame, but with dignity restored. The narrator's voice closes. Years ago, Samuel lifted 2 children out of the cold. Tonight they lifted him out of a cage, because kindness never dies. It waits, it grows, and when the time is right, it saves. Outside the courthouse, the crowd spilled into the street, reporters scribbling, neighbors murmuring with disbelief. But none of it mattered to Samuel. What mattered were the 2 figures at his side, no longer children shivering in an alley, but grown adults who carried the strength he had nurtured. Samuel, old and weary, smiled through his tears, knowing the bond they shared had outlasted hunger, ridicule, and betrayal. Kindness, once dismissed as weakness, had become his salvation. And as the story closes, the call goes out. Would you have made Samuel's choice that night in the alley? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story of sacrifice, justice, and redemption.